Hi everybody, it's Ms. Ovadia. Gonna create another video for you. This one should be on the short side. In class, I started to hand out this paper called Cold War Hotspots. If you weren't in class, that's fine. I'm gonna put it on Google Classroom. So what I would say is take a look at it, and that way you know what kind of things to write down. You don't have to print it. As long as you take the notes on separate paper, you should be fine. So I'm only going to cover part of this presentation and of this handout, and then I'll give you an assignment that goes with it. So I'm going to head over to my presentation, and now we know the basics of the Cold War. We know that it was between the Soviet Union and the United States. Hopefully you understand concepts like Cold War, superpowers, arms race, mutually assured destruction, and you know about the effect the Cold War had in Germany, specifically how it split up Germany and so on. Now we're going to look at how the Cold War affected other parts of the world, specifically Korea, Cuba, Vietnam, and Afghanistan. So these actual wars, these are not cold wars, they're hot, are known as proxy wars. I would write down this definition of proxy wars. What's happening here is that the US and the Soviet Union aren't fighting each other directly, but they are each using substitutes. So the example that I gave in class is, let's say that, here we go. Let's say that there are two people who are in the middle of a fight, right? Let's say that, I don't know, John and Jane are in some big argument, and I am Team Jane all the way, right? But so, and somebody else, let's say my husband, he's Team John all the way. So my husband and I aren't going to fight each other directly because we have nuclear weapons. I know how weird this sounds. So instead, I'm going to give Jane all kinds of guns and money and maybe even soldiers. And my husband's going to give John guns and money and maybe even soldiers, so that when Jane and John go to war, they're actually being supported by my husband and me. So he and I are not fighting directly, but we're using substitutes. So I hope that made some sense. The four parts of the world we're going to: North and South Korea, which of course are located right over here if you see my cursor. Then we'll head over to Cuba, which is right over here off the coast of Florida, this long skinny island. We'll head over to Afghanistan, which is this landlocked country right here. And then we'll take a look at Vietnam, which is the S-shaped country in Southeast Asia. Today I am just going to briefly talk about the Korean War. Keep in mind, World War II ended in 1945. The Berlin Airlift ended in 1949. And by 1950, there is another war going on. This one is in Korea. So, once upon a time, there was only one Korea, but after World War II, it was divided into two countries, North and South, and they're being divided at the 38th parallel. A parallel is a line of latitude. In the North, in the late 40s, early 50s, North Korea was a communist country, which of course it still is. It was more industrial. I wouldn't call it really industrial anymore. And it received all kinds of support, including guns and money, from the Soviet Union. South Korea, it was not a democracy in the late 40s and early 50s. It was like one of those weak countries. They're not sure which way they're going to go. So we're just going to call them non-communist. They're rural, so more like the country than the city, and they were supported by the Western Bloc, especially the United States. The United States wants to turn South Korea into a strong democracy. War will begin. Why? Because both sides only want one Korea, but they want it to be their way. So North Korea wants all of Korea to be communist, and South Korea and the United States want all of South Korea to be a democracy. There are some skirmishes. Those are like small battles that broke out on the border between North and South Korea, and war begins in 1950. The United States is going to back the South. They're going to provide them with guns, money, and soldiers. And then the Soviet Union will back the North, primarily with military assistance. I'm going to show you a short video, And what I want you to look for is how the battle lines change. So here it looks like the North is going to win this war. Very early on, they take over almost all of South Korea. But soon, the Americans are going to join in, and they're going to push the North back. Within a few months, it looks like the South Koreans are going to win. But then the North, with the assistance of Communist China, which is located right here, will push back the South. And now you'll notice that the pace is going to slow down and remain. So very little territory is changing hands. And I'm going to pause the video right here because what you see is where we start the war with the two sides divided at the 13th parallel isn't so different from where we end the war 4 years later. The line is a little squiggly, but it's still roughly at the 38th parallel. So if I were to ask you what's the result of the Korean War, you'd have to say it really ends as a draw. Nobody really wins or loses. And in fact, that's technically true too, because the two sides signed an armistice. That says they're not going to fight anymore. But North and South Korea never signed a peace treaty, which means now, so many decades later, the two sides, the two countries, are still technically at war. Because they're at war, there is a buffer zone between North and South Korea that's known as the demilitarized zone. So this zone is carefully guarded by the North Koreans, by the South Koreans, and the Americans, who still have a major military presence in South Korea. Folks in South Korea, like the soldier you see over here, are looking north to try to make sure that the North isn't going to attack. But these folks back here, some of them are looking south, but they're also looking north. I think you know at this point that North Korea is an incredibly repressive place to live. And so these guys are concerned about war with the South, but they're also worried about North Korean citizens trying to defect or escape North Korea through the demilitarized zone. So I'm going to end this here by introducing you to an assignment. I noticed that I didn't say who started the war. I just said that there were skirmishes at the border. So I'm going to close this up and head back over to that assignment. This was the handout that I gave out in class. And the things that I just told you about, you can basically take notes on this left-hand side here. The assignment that I'd like you to complete is on the very last page. What you have here is two different excerpts from two different textbooks. One is from North Korea and one is from South Korea. They're real. You can see over here, the South Korean textbook was from 2001 and the North Korean textbook is from 1999. I want you to answer these 4 questions. Basically, tell me how the war started according to each textbook, and then give me an example of some biased language, some words that the authors use that give you a hint as to which is North and which is South. Tell me which textbook you think is more reliable and give me a reason why. And then finally, tell me which one is the North Korean book and which is the South Korean book. You can do that on a sheet of paper and then submit it to me through Google Classroom. I'll make that available to you so you could just submit it online. If you're having success using Genius Scan, terrific. You can send it to me any other electronic way that works for you, depending on your circumstances at home. And again, I'll put up a comment or a question thread. So if there's anything that you need to know or questions that you have about this lesson, you can get in touch. Thank you very much. Be well.